Okay, now, does GDP measure what we want it to? We talked about what's included in it, how to measure it, but it's not a perfect measurement of the activity in our economy, which is really what we're trying to get to. So it's the best we have, but it's not perfect because there are two things that it does not capture for us. One is it does not capture total production, and the second is that it's not a measure of well-being. So let's talk about both of those. So let's talk about production first. There are certain types of things that are definitely going on in our economy that are not captured by GDP. And the two of those are household production and the underground economy. So household production, if I pay somebody to clean my house, that gets included in GDP. If I clean it myself, it does not get included. If I mow the lawn, it does not get included. If I pay a lawn care company to come mow it, then it does get included. So things that are done in household, we can't really capture these because, number one, there's no way for us to measure it. We'd have to, survey everybody and say, now, how much time do you think you spent cleaning this? The other thing is the value of it. We do this based on the value, and the value of my time and the value of someone else's time might be very different. If I'm a lawyer getting paid $1,000 an hour and I take 2 hours to clean my house, then we could say the value of that's $2,000. If I'm unemployed and I'm not doing anything, then the value is nowhere near $2,000. So we can't really quantify household production. So that's a bit of a flaw in the measurement, but it's something that has always been there, okay? That has always been the case. So when we're comparing this year to last year, this year to 10 years ago, that element was still there and probably has not changed significantly. So we're still making an apples to apples comparison. The other thing is the underground economy. So this can be any activity that's not reported. So it could be illegal stuff, like there's a lot of people making a lot of money dealing drugs. That's not getting reported in GDP. It could also just be like if I go to the salon and get my hair cut and I pay for it, that gets counted in GDP. If she says, come to my house on Sunday, I'll cut it for you for half that, that's under the table. And that's not counted. Most of the time people are doing that either because it's illegal or to avoid taxes. I guess technically if I pay the boy down the street to mow my lawn, that's not getting reported either because he's not probably filing taxes because he's 10 or whatever. So technically that would be part of the underground economy too. And that, again, that's always been there. So anything that people aren't claiming, either because it's illegal or they're avoiding taxes or whatever. But countries with a large underground economy, that's a signal. So we call that the informal sector. In a lot of developing countries, it's really, really, really high, much more than it is here. It usually means that people are trying to get around either high taxes or regulations or something like that, or they're trying to hide it from the government. So the more activity you have going on in the underground economy, that can indicate, either a large illegal thing or a government that's too tight, that's too restrictive, that's taking, 60% of your taxes, and so people are trying to kind of avoid that. So that's not in there. And again, since it's not counted, we can't capture that. The other thing that's missing from GDP is a measure of well-being. So one of the numbers we look at, GDP per capita, is a really important number. We divide that by the population. That's how we can compare GDP from one country versus another. So the United States versus Sweden. Sweden's much smaller. They're obviously going to have a lower GDP. But when we do GDP per person or per capita, that gives us a much better measure of standard of living. So it still doesn't, even if we could capture all the production, it still doesn't reflect a couple of other things, like the value of leisure. In some countries, like Australia, I think they get like 6 or 8 weeks vacation every year. That's pretty standard. And so obviously if people are working less, that's going to hold down the productivity. And so you're going to have a lower GDP, but they're okay with that. So their goal isn't to have the highest GDP as possible because they want to have, they value that leisure time. If people retire earlier, that would bring down GDP because they're not working, but they value that leisure. Pollution and other negative side effects. So anytime the government says, okay, there's a cap on pollution, it's going to raise the price of things, and therefore it's going to decrease the output. We talked about that a little bit in Chapter 3. That would increase the input costs, therefore decrease the output. If a country said, I don't care how much you pollute, then it would be cheaper and easier to produce stuff, and so you would have higher output, higher GDP. But that comes at a cost. And we saw this when the Olympics were in China several years ago. They had been growing gangbusters, but had no pollution controls in there. So they had high growth, but at a cost of a lot of pollution. And before the whole world was coming to look at it, they were trying to kind of clean it up and kind of stuff. So GDP, a higher GDP could mean that there's more side effects. It could mean there's less leisure. It could mean there's more pollution. And it maybe not always, but it could mean that. It doesn't reflect crime and other social problems. Just because one country has a higher GDP doesn't mean they have a higher standard of living. If there's a lot of crime there, it doesn't measure that. It also doesn't. It's the total income or output of the country, but doesn't say how that's distributed. So you could have a country where 10% are super, super, super rich and everybody else is poor, and the total for the country could still look good. But that doesn't mean everybody in that country gets to benefit from that. So these are things, again, they're very hard to quantify, which is why they're not in there. And people do take a stab at doing like a green GDP that factors in pollution and that kind of cost. But again, these things are very hard to quantify, so it's hard to get everybody to agree how to measure that, which is why we don't. So there have been times like in World War II, GDP was really high because the men were off at war, which meant the women all went to work for the first time for most of them. So you almost doubled your workforce. And then you're making all kinds of stuff for the war effort, but you're not, people weren't better off at that time. There were rationing, there were shortages, they weren't making stuff for consumer goods, they were making stuff for the war. So even though you saw GDP growth during that period, the people were not better off during that period. So that's something that, again, the number is an indicator for us, but it doesn't tell us everything. Now, another important thing to think about with GDP is real versus nominal GDP. So if we see GDP is going up, and we said it's the market value of goods and services, does that mean GDP increased because we're actually producing more, or just because the prices, the market value of those things went up? There's a big difference. So the BEA, the Bureau of Economic Analysis, calculates nominal and real GDP. So nominal is just GDP in that year's numbers. So if it's 2019, it's the value of everything that was produced in 2019 numbers. Real GDP, however, takes the value, the quantity, but it links it to a base year's prices. And what this does, generally right now we're using 2009 as the base year. It doesn't matter what year. But what you're saying is, I'm taking the output from these different years, but I'm using the same time frames dollars so that I can see how much of that change was actually increased output versus just a change in the prices. So they use something called a chain-weighted indexing to get the most accurate number. I'm not really gonna get into that, but mathy people will tell you why that's a more accurate number. So the reason we do this, real GDP it accounts for inflation. So nominal GDP minus inflation, the change in the prices, equals real GDP, all right? So here's how that's calculated, all right? So we have two time periods right here, for 2009 and 2017. So to calculate nominal GDP, we'll do that one first. All we do is take the quantity times that year's prices. So, because we want the GDP is not the quantity that's produced, but the dollar value, the market value of what was produced. So 80 eye exams at $40 each. That has a value of $3,200. 90 pizzas times $11 each gives us $990 worth of pizzas were produced, and 15 shoes at $90 each is $1,350 worth of shoes. That's nominal GDP. If I add it up, I pretend that's all that is produced in this economy. Then the total production for this economy is just add up those three things, and I get 5540. I do the same thing for 2017. So the nominal GDP will be 100 eye exams at $50. So that's $5,000. Now here, look, you can see that I produced more eye exams and the price went up. So it's hard for me to tell how much, if you only have 3 goods, you could figure it out. But we're talking about a gazillion goods, so we have to be a little more exact. And then here I have 820 times 200 is $2,000 worth of shoes. So I add those up and I get 7,800. So that's nominal GDP for 2017, all right? Now, to get the percentage change is an important thing that we do a lot. This is how I say it. The new number minus the old number over the old number. New minus the starting point over the starting point times 100. Usually skip that. So if we're looking at percentage increase in nominal GDP, I would say I went up to 7,800. I started at 5540 divided by 5540 times 100, and so that gives me 2260 over 5540 times 100 gives me 40.79%. So over this 8-year period, GDP increased 40.79. If we're just going to average that evenly over 8 years, we get about 5.1% per year annual increase. That's just an average over that time period. So, did we really produce 5% more? Well, we can see here that there's changes in the prices. So no. So let's find out how much more we actually produce, because that's what we're trying to find out here. So to get real GDP, we're going to take the 2009 quantity times the 2009 prices. Well, that's what we already did here, right? So we've got eye exams, pizza, and shoes. So I've got 80, 90, and 15, $40, $11.90. I'm just taking these two right here. And so my real GDP, and I'm using 2009 as my base year. So real GDP is exactly the same thing I already did. So that's 3,200, 990, and 1,350. So that's 5,540. Now, real GDP for 2017. I'm going to take the 2017 quantity times the 2009 price. All right. So 180 and 20, these are these two quantities, but then I'm going to use the 2009 prices still, because I'm looking at just the increase. So that's 40, 11, and 90. I gotta hold one, I can't have both numbers changing. I have to hold one thing steady. When we get to inflation, we're going to hold the quantity steady and look at the change in prices. But now I'm looking at production, so I'm going to hold the prices steady at the base year. You could pick 2009, you could put them both in 2017, you could pick some arbitrary thing in between. But the thing is, both years you have to use the same year's prices, whatever year you choose. And so now I've got 4,000, 80 times 11 is 880, and 20 times 90 is 1,800. So I get 6680 is real GDP. Okay? So now I've got two real numbers. I'm going to calculate the percentage change the same way I did up here. So I'm going to say, all right, 6680 minus 5540, the new minus the old over the starting point there, 5540 times 100. So that means GDP, real GDP increased by $1,140. I divide that by my starting point. So I get 20.57%. And that's over 8 years. So if I just want to get over 8 years. So if I want to divide that, if I want to get an average, I'll divide that by 8 years. And I get an average of 2.57% is my annual. So this tells me a couple different important things. Nominal GDP increased by 5.1%. Real GDP increased by 2.5%. 2.5% is how much the actual increase in production. The difference between the two is your inflation rate over that period of time. So, real GDP, you have to use the base year's prices, no matter what year. You could do this for a whole bunch of years, but you'll use 2009 for all of them, or whatever base year you pick. So again, the difference between real and nominal is inflation. So if we look at, this is nominal and real GDP from 95 up to 2016. And the difference, so at the base year, they'll always be the same because, they're you're using the same year for those. So the difference here is inflation. So the bigger that gap there, the bigger this gap, the more the inflation. And this is going to be, adding to it. But the bigger the gap in between, the higher the inflation you have for that time period. Okay, another calculation that we have in here that we can use is the GDP deflator. So we're looking at, this is a way to calculate the price level. We're going to look at another way in the next chapter, but this is one way to do it when you have GDP. So the GDP deflator, which is an indicator of the price level, you take nominal divided by real times 100. Since we know the difference between these two things is inflation rate. So if I take nominal divided by real times 100, that gives me a measure of the inflation rate. So it's an index. So you'd still have to calculate the percentage change. So this is an example here where they took 2013. So they took nominal divided by real times 100, and so this is the GDP the GDP deflator, which is really like an index. And I did the same thing for 2014. Nominal divided by real times 100, and I get 108. Then, once I had these two numbers, I did the percentage change. Again, this is your new number minus your old number to get the change in. Over your starting point times 100, 1.5 is how much the price level rose. So we use we divide nominal by real to get the deflator, which is really like kind of an index thing. And then we look at the percentage change in the two deflators. So that's another way to look at inflation. And then the other thing I wanted to talk about in here are some of the other measures. We spent the whole time talking about GDP, gross domestic product, but there are other ones. Gross national product is one, production performed by citizens of the U.S. even if they're overseas. So if it's a U.S. citizen working abroad, or if it's a U.S. company operating in Mexico or something like that. National income is GDP essentially minus depreciation, okay? Depreciation is using up, if you've had accounting, especially if you've had accounting too. So what this is trying to do is, there's a difference between a company who is just replacing worn out equipment and a company who is buying additional equipment to expand. And so this is kind of looking at that. So if I back out just the stuff that people are replacing what got worn out, which means you're treading water, you're not getting ahead, right? You're staying in the same place, you're just spending money to stay in the same place. So that's what that one measures. Personal income, again, we said we can measure it by expenditures or by income. So personal income is how much people receive. This includes transfer payments. So how much money you essentially have, the total money you have coming in. Disposable income is personal income minus taxes. So that's how much left, that's how much you are able to spend or save. This is the main thing that's driving consumption. So if your income stays the same, but your taxes go up, you have less money to spend. So even though your income didn't change, your spending will definitely change. So this is a very important one because this is what drives consumption. And as we saw, consumption is by far the biggest component of GDP. So this is a very important thing. And as we talk about policies going forward, we have to keep that in mind, that things that affect consumption will have a much bigger impact on GDP as a total because it's such a big component on it. So if we look at a couple of these, GDP and GNP are very close. The difference here, right, is your depreciation. That's the difference between this one and this one. Personal income, and this difference right here is taxes. So that just kind of tells you, these are 2016 numbers. Obviously the numbers have changed since then, but the relationship between them is about the same. These two are pretty close. And then this is income. We said you could look at GDP by income or expenditures. We use the expenditure model because there's only 4 components. This has a lot more. Again, I looked at the updated numbers for 2019, and the numbers have changed, but the percents are about the same. So you can see where so this is government's income, this is personal income, this would be, companies' income here, and so this would be, this could be to either group. So this would be, kind of like your investment thing. This would be kind of like your consumption. And so those same groups of people. So the percentages are about the same. So that's just another way to look at it. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. I just want to show you, because sometimes you'll see different numbers. And they're all correct. They just measure different things. So you'll see different numbers in there as people point out different things, but the main one we use is GDP, and that's the main one that's used also to determine the business cycles and whether we're expanding or contracting.